Welcome back, dear listener, wherever you may be this evening, tucked under soft covers, gazing out at a rainy window, or simply lying still in the quiet glow of night. I'm so glad you've joined us. Whether you're here to ease a restless mind, escape the day's noise, or simply drift off to something gentle and slow, this space is yours. Take a moment to exhale. Let the day fall away behind you. The screens, the noise, the hurry, none of that follows us where we're going tonight. Because now we're slipping back through time, beyond the pages of history books and the bright lights of modern empires. We're entering a quieter, darker age, one shaped by hunger, by cold stone, and by the terrible weight of a crown too heavy for the man who wore it. Tonight's story is a slow descent into the shadow corridors of medieval power, a tale of a brutal king who ruled not with reason or mercy, but with fear, a man who found pleasure not in justice, but in executions, whose silence could fill a city square, and whose madness would shape the kingdom for generations. But this is not a tale of war or triumph. It is a story of silence, of forgotten names, of eyes that watched and mouths that dared not speak. So if you're ready, let your thoughts drift like autumn leaves on a still pond. Settle in, and follow me now into the cold stone halls of a kingdom ruled by one man's madness, and the long, slow quiet that followed. This is the brutal reign of a medieval king who executed for fun. There was no trumpet blast when the mad king rose to the throne. No parade to the muddy lanes. No joyful tossing of flower petals from balconies. Only a gray morning sky and the steady toll of a cracked bronze bell. The previous king, his father, had died quietly in his sleep, though rumors whispered of darker endings. Poison in his wine. A blade in the dark. No one dared ask. No one truly wished to know. When the boy, for he was barely more than a boy, stood before the altar to be crowned, the bishop's hands trembled as he placed the crown upon a head already bowed by something far heavier than metal. The court watched with breath held. The courtiers offered careful nods. The peasants in the square outside barely stirred. Even the wind seemed to wait. From the start, something was amiss. The new king, whose name, over time, would be carved from memory, did not weep, nor smile, nor show the soft confusion of a young ruler uncertain of his fate. He stared forward, unmoving, like a statue left out in a storm. His hands were still. His voice, when he finally spoke the ritual vow, was cold and flat, as if reading aloud the execution notice of a stranger. Those nearby noted how his eyes did not blink, how his lips barely moved. It was as though the boy had left the room, and something else had stood in his place. The crown was a thing of iron, old, heavy, rimmed with chipped garnets. It had been passed down for generations, worn by heroes, tyrants, and madmen alike. But when it rested on his head, it seemed to change. It tilted slightly, not from weight, but from resistance, as though the very metal recoiled from its bearer. The priest stepped back quickly, mumbling a prayer meant more for himself than for the newly anointed. The throne room echoed with silence. No cheers rose. No celebrations began. The people filed out slowly. The coronation feast was held. Thin wine, hard bread, and overcooked venison, but laughter was rare and no songs were sung. His name was written in the records, but over time, even the scribes grew cautious. Some letters were left out. Some pages were torn away. Instead, people referred to him only as a king, or when they were certain no ears were listening, the shadowed one. It was said he never slept, that the candles in his chambers burned through every night, casting tall, flickering silhouettes on the stone walls. Guards were posted outside, but none ever saw him leave. He spoke with few, trusted fewer still. Ministers were summoned to meet him, and then not seen again for weeks, or ever. Servants whispered of screams from the inner halls, of blood-stained linens left at their doors in the morning. The castle, once full of noise and ceremony, became still and dim. The hearths burned low. The musicians fled. Even the dogs stopped barking. No one knew when the change began, because no one could say what the king had been before. Some claimed he had been born quiet, that even as a child, he had spent hours staring at the rain, unmoving. Others said something had broken inside him, that a wound in the mind left unchecked had festered over time like a rot behind a wall. A few insisted dark forces had visited him in the night, that he had made a pact. But these were rumors, and those who spoke too freely often vanished, their homes left cold, their names scratched out of ledgers. Over time, people stopped asking, yet the kingdom remained. The fields were plowed, the grain was harvested, taxes were paid. Life outwardly continued, but beneath it all was a sense that something deep had shifted. The peasants did not whistle at dawn. The priests lit candles more frequently. The air itself seemed heavier. A bird flew slower. Dogs growled at doorways for no reason. And above it all, in the great stone keep at the center of the realm, the king sat on his throne of oak and iron, unmoving, unblinking, watching a world that had grown very small. This was not tyranny, not yet. That would come later, as certain as winter. At first, there were only rumors. A merchant in prison for smiling too brightly. A scribe beaten for writing the king's name without permission. A woman taken from her bed because her dreams were said to have displeased the crown. But these were isolated things. They could be explained away. A misunderstanding. A local official acting rashly. The people told themselves it was not the king. Surely not the king. He was distant. Strange, yes, but not cruel. Not yet. But those who had lived through other reigns, the old ones, with bent backs and watery eyes, knew better. They saw the signs. They remembered what it meant when silence ruled the court, when fear settled behind every curtain, when laughter became dangerous. They whispered warnings to their children. They lit candles before locked doors, and they began to dream of fire. It is easy from a distance to imagine evil as loud, as theatrical, but often it begins in a whisper, in a pause, in a cold room, in the eyes of a young king who smiles at nothing. And so began the reign of the Mad King, not with swords, not with fire, but with silence, thick, creeping, and absolute. As the king settled into his reign, the land beneath him did not crumble all at once. It changed slowly, imperceptibly at first, like the turning of leaves in a distant forest or the gathering of mist before a storm. What once had been a kingdom of rhythm and routine, of carts creaking along village roads, of bells marking the morning prayers, of children laughing near market stalls, became instead a realm of silence and smoke. It was not imposed by decree. The silence came of its own accord, as if the very stones of the kingdom had chosen to hush themselves in his presence. In the villages closest to the castle, the change was felt most keenly. Blacksmiths hammered more softly. Innkeepers poured ale with fewer jokes. Songs, once sung during sowing and harvesting, faded into low hums or vanished altogether. Children were hushed by their mothers when they asked too many questions. People spoke less in general, not out of law, but out of caution, because eyes were everywhere now. Pale-eyed riders in the king's livery came through more often than before. They didn't speak. They took no notes. They only watched, and then they left. But soon after their visits, someone might be gone. A baker, a priest, a farmhand, just gone, without explanation. Even the church was quieter. The great cathedrals, once echoing with hymns and the solemn cadence of liturgy, now kept their doors half shut. The bishops preached shorter sermons. Priests no longer gave fiery condemnations or calls for justice. The king, it was said, had taken a keen interest in sermons, especially those that strayed from obedience. A single sentence, once spoken boldly from the pulpit, could be plucked from the air and carried on the wind all the way to the castle. What happened to those who spoke such words was never confirmed, but the people noticed which altars sat abandoned. In the towns, guard became a more regular sight, not the old men with halberds and bored expressions. These were the king's own men, armored in blackened steel, faces hidden behind visors that never lifted. They walked in pairs or in threes, even when no threat was present. Sometimes they stood outside shops for hours, speaking to no one. Other times, they entered homes and searched without reason. No warrants, no explanation, just a cold nod and the clatter of boots. And when they left, they often took something, a scroll, a candle, a person. Tradesmen learned to adapt. The butcher learned not to comment on strange meat requests. The tailor stopped asking questions about bloodstains. The printer, once known for his cheeky pamphlets and clever poems, began to produce only blank pages, sheets of silence, bound and sold to those who understood their meaning. Those who could read learned not to pass around books unless the covers were plain and the titles dull. Even in writing, words were dangerous. Above all this, the castle loomed, not larger, but somehow darker. Smoke rose from its towers day and night, not the smoke of feasts or fireplaces, but something else, thicker, more bitter, a smell that clung to the air like rot to a wound. No one could say what it was, but the birds no longer nested in its rafters. Dogs would not go near the bridge, and those who carried messages to its gates came back pale and quiet, if they came back at all. Inside the castle, life was colder still. The servants moved with purpose, their eyes lowered. The tapestries were removed from the halls. The mirrors, once polished to brilliance, were taken down one by one. The king did not like reflections. The great hall, once full of color and banquets, now sat in permanent shadow. Fires were not lit unless ordered. Music was forbidden. The throne room was washed in silence, broken only by the scrape of boots or the sharp bark of command. Visitors to the court were fewer now. Nobles, once eager to seek favor, found excuses to remain on their distant states. Ambassadors from neighboring realms sent letters, not envoys. The court shrank, and with it, the sense of life. A hush settled over every corridor. Even footsteps seemed to make less sound. And those who served in the castle often developed a strange habit, speaking only in whispers, even when no one was around. It was said the walls had ears. It was also said that the walls remembered what they heard. And yet, nothing had been declared. There was no proclamation forbidding music, no law mandating silence. The king had not spoken publicly in weeks, then months, but his silence spoke louder than any decree. The people felt it in their bones. It was a reign of implication, a shadow that moved through hallways, a presence that filled a room before it was entered. The silence was not an absence. It was a weapon. In the countryside, the fear spread more slowly. Farmers continued to till their soil. Shepherds watched their flocks. But even there, something was lost. The songs sung to scare birds from the crops ceased. The festivals marking the equinox grew shorter. Maypoles stood undecorated. The great harvest fires, once symbols of gratitude and joy, were lit quickly and burned out before dark. Not because the people had forgotten how to celebrate, but because the fear had crept in like mold beneath the thatch. And where there is silence, smoke often follows. The smoke came at night, thin at first, rising behind hills and barn roofs, then thicker, sometimes with the sound of hooves, other times with nothing at all, a barn gone, a house smoldering, no explanation, no arrests, just smoke and silence. The king, they said, watched it all, from a window in the tallest tower, his face never visible, only a pale outline behind a curtain, watching, always watching. So the kingdom endured, not through strength or peace, but through quiet fear. The people learned to live in the pause between footfalls, to eat quickly, to speak in riddles, to leave no trace. And in that silence, the king grew stronger. For silence, when cultivated with cruelty, becomes a fortress more impenetrable than stone. They said the king's eyes had no color. Not blue, not green, not gray, but something paler, a shade like frost on a window pane just before it melts. When he entered a room, it was the eyes that people noticed first. Not the way he walked, not the stiff weight of his crown or the trailing edge of his cloak, but the way his gaze settled. It did not flicker or dart like most men's. It did not soften when it met a familiar face. It held still, steady, precise, and cold, as though measuring something that no one else could see. To be looked at by the king was to feel suddenly unmade. In paintings from early in his reign, few as they were, most destroyed or hidden in vaults, his eyes were rendered without spark. Artists attempted to give them life, to please the crown by capturing some trace of humanity. But the result was always the same, blankness, flat pupils suspended in pale ice. One court painter is said to have fled the castle after 3 days of sitting with the king, muttering that eyes like that belonged to something not born. Another, more daring, dared ask the king to look away while he worked. He was never seen again. Those who served him up close spoke of how rarely he blinked. He could sit for hours in silence, his head slightly tilted, watching, a servant carrying water, a clerk tallying grain, a guard shifting his weight. Nothing escaped him. Not a cough, not a whisper. He didn't interrupt, didn't scold. He only watched. And the weight of that watching was unbearable. Many palace staff asked to be reassigned to outer duties, stables, kitchens, even sewage channels, just to escape the eyes. A few took to wearing hoods. Most simply learned not to meet his gaze at all. Yet the eyes were not angry. They didn't flash with temper or twitch with irritation. They were calm, controlled, and that, perhaps, was worse. Rage is familiar, human. It can be negotiated with, appeased. But the king's gaze held none of that. It was clinical, like a man studying an insect before pinning it to a board. You could not reason with those eyes. You could only survive them. There are stories, whispered mostly by exiled nobles and long-dead scribes, of how he tested his own court with a stare, of how he would sit on his throne for a full hour, silent, motionless, his eyes scanning the room like a lantern's beam. He would look at each member of the court, one by one, waiting. No one knew what he sought. A twitch of the mouth, a glance exchanged, a sigh too loud. But once, after such a session, 2 barons were escorted from the hall and were never heard from again. No charges, no trial, only eyes and then absence. The royal family, what little of it remained, fared no better. The queen, a quiet, gentle woman from a distant noble house, stopped appearing at court entirely. Her face, one seen frequently beside his in portraits and ceremonies, vanished from public view. When asked, officials said she had taken ill, but the servants whispered that her silence had been purchased with fear, that she had spoken out once, softly, perhaps not even in anger, and had spent 3 nights locked in the northern tower, for which the king's eyes watched the realm. After that, she spoke no more. The prince, their only child, grew up in the shadow of those eyes. Pale, frail, and distant, the boy rarely spoke above a whisper. He flinched at sudden movements. He never asked questions. It was said that he had been forced to sit opposite his father at meals and endure the full weight of that cold gaze until his food went untouched, cold on the plate. He was taught by tutors handpicked by the king, scholars who taught obedience before knowledge. His drawings, when found, were always the same: empty thrones, eyes and windows, rooms without doors. But it was not just the family or the court that suffered beneath those eyes. The eyes traveled. When the king rode to the countryside, flanked by guards, his black cloak drawn tight, villagers would scatter from a road. Even a glimpse of his pale gaze from atop his horse was enough to unsettle the mind. Chickens stopped laying. Children cried without cause. Old men crossed themselves twice. Once, during a rare visit to a town square, the king dismounted and stood in the middle of the crowd. He did not speak. He only turned slowly, letting his eyes rest on each face. One by one, a merchant dropped his produce. A mother fainted. A dog ran howling from the square. The king smiled, just faintly, then returned to his horse. That night, 7 people were taken from the town. No explanation was given. His gaze, some said, was a kind of test, a mirror. It reflected not your face, but your fear. Others believed it had power, that to be looked at for too long by the king was to fall ill, to forget yourself, to change. A few said that his eyes could see the truth, that no lie could stand before them, but most simply feared them, avoided them, pretended not to notice. And the king knew this. He used it. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. When displeased, he simply looked. And that look carried the weight of consequence. It was enough to empty rooms, to kill conversation, to command obedience deeper than law. In time, the kingdom learned to move without being seen. Doors were opened softly. Windows shuttered at dusk. Curtains were drawn, even on clouded days. The king, it was said, could see through stone, through skin, through soul. But still, no one left. No one fled the court or abandoned their posts. Because the king's gaze also held a promise, not just a pain, but a permanence. You could close your eyes. You could turn away. But the king would still be watching. He always was. The throne room had once been a place of noise. Not joyful noise, perhaps, but the constant murmur of political life. Before the king's ascent, it had been filled daily with footsteps on stone, voices echoing beneath high-arched ceilings, the rustle of parchment, the clang of mail, the creak of wooden benches pushed aside in haste. There had been arguments, laughter, proclamations, petitions. A court, living, breathing, ever shifting. But now, those sounds were gone. What remained was a strange, unnatural stillness, broken only by whispers. Faint, hesitant, desperate things. Whispers that clung to the walls like mildew. No one spoke above a hush anymore, not even within the hall built to amplify speech. Petitioners no longer stood to address the court. Instead, they knelt, heads bowed, voices low, often stuttering. What they said didn't matter. The king did not respond. He sat slouched upon his throne of blackened oak, his chin resting lightly on one knuckle, eyes unblinking, gaze fixed but unreadable. He did not interrupt. He did not nod. He did not dismiss. He only listened, and when the petitioner had finished, often sweating and trembling with the effort of speaking under such scrutiny, the king would raise a single finger. Not always, only sometimes. And when he did, 2 guards would appear and lead the speaker away. The rest of the court would continue as though nothing had happened. These gestures became symbols, feared more than shouted decrees. A hand raised meant disappearance. A tilt of the head might signal leniency or amusement. An unexpected smile, rare and unsettling, caused more panic than reassurance. Over time, the courtiers began to communicate in glances, in nods, in gestures as subtle as the movement of an eyebrow. Words had become dangerous. Even praise spoken aloud might be interpreted as mockery. Better to say nothing, better to whisper. And yet, despite the fear, the throne room was always full. Nobles came from distant provinces. Knights, lords, scribes, envoys. All of them drawn, like moths to a black flame, by the undeniable weight of the king's presence. Power, even when veiled in terror, was still power. And many believed, perhaps hoped, they could master it, harness it, survive it. They dressed in their finest. They bowed with elaborate flourishes. They gifted golden trinkets, exotic birds, rare wines. They brought wives and sons to curry favor. But in the king's throne room, such things meant little. He accepted no gifts. He offered no thanks. He did not raise his voice. But always he watched. Those who thrived in the new court were not the bold or the brilliant. They were the quiet ones, the clever liars, the ones who knew how to fade into corners, how to listen while pretending not to. Men with soft shoes and softer voices. Women who smiled without warmth. They became the true players in the court, the whisperers. They trafficked in secrets, traded half-truths like currency. It was not uncommon to see 2 nobles seated side by side in total silence, only their fingers twitching beneath the table, sending messages in the hidden language of the paranoid. The walls seemed to listen, too. The hall had changed in ways few could explain. The torches burned lower. The tapestries had all been removed, exposing bare stone. The floor had been scrubbed so many times it shone with a dull sheen, like bone. And the acoustics, once designed to carry proclamations, now made even the softest whisper bounce strangely. You could never be sure where a sound originated. A phrase murmured at one and might seem to come from the opposite wall. It unsettled people. Some swore the king had changed the design of the room, subtly, that something had been built beneath the stone, a second chamber, a listening chamber. But no one investigated. Curiosity, in the new court, was the most dangerous vice of all. There were rumors of secret meetings, of select courtiers summoned in the dead of night, to stand before the king in his private hall. Not the grand throne room, but a smaller chamber with no windows and only a single candle. Those who attended never spoke of what occurred there. In fact, many never spoke again at all. They returned pale, silent, hands shaking. Some took to drink. Others disappeared. But it was said the king asked no questions in these sessions. He simply stared, and sometimes smiled. The royal advisors, once numerous, had dwindled to a core of 3. Their names were not known to the public. Their roles were undefined. They stood at the edge of the throne room, always dressed in identical robes, faces half covered by shadowed hoods. They never spoke, not even to one another. It was said they had taken vows of silence, or that their tongues had been removed. But they wrote constantly, small notebooks filled with tiny script, eyes darting as they watched court. No one knew what they recorded, but their presence made every cough, every breath, feel weighted. The throne itself had changed, too. No longer the gilded sea of state it once was. It had been altered, subtly, cruelly. The velvet had been stripped. The carvings at the armrests had been recut. Where once lions stood, now there were wolves. Their eyes had been hollowed out. The wood had been darkened with some kind of oil, and when one leaned close, a faint metallic smell clung to it. Iron, perhaps, or something older. Blood, some whispered, and at the center of it all, the king, still, silent, watching. He rarely left the throne room. Meals were brought to him. He ate alone. He slept, if at all, in a chamber above the hall, accessible only by a narrow stair behind a locked door. Servants claimed to hear movement there at odd hours. Low chanting, laughter, the rustle of robes. But no one dared investigate. And so, the throne room became a place of whispers. Not governance, not policy, just whispers. Of fear, of ambition, of survival. Each day began the same. Courtiers filing in with careful steps, heads bowed. And each day ended with a few fewer voices. A few more empty seats. They say a kingdom can survive many things, war, famine, even invasion. But a kingdom ruled by whispers becomes something else entirely. Not a place of law or loyalty, but of dread. A place where the walls are closer than they seem, where silence listens, and where one man's cold, unblinking eyes determine the fate of all. The kingdom changed in the way old houses change, not suddenly, but in creaks and drafts and slow shifts of shadow that go unnoticed until the walls begin to sag. What had once been a realm governed by rules, however harsh or uneven, slowly dissolved into something stranger. Law still existed on parchment, tucked into leather-bound volumes kept in the royal archives. Judges still wore robes. Clerks still pressed seals into cooling wax. But none of it mattered, because justice now came not from books or courts. It came from glances, from moods, from rumors, and from the king's silent, absolute approval of cruelty. It began subtly, as such things do. A miller in the northern fens was found guilty of disrespect. Not to a noble, nor to a church, but to the wind. He had cursed it during a drought, loudly and in front of others. And so he was taken, not by constables or summoned by writ, but by the king's riders, who came at dawn with cold hands and blank expressions. The villagers found him the next day in the square, tied to a post, silent, eyes wide. No marks on him, no message left, just a sign nailed above his head, with a single word burned into it. Blasphemy. After that, things quickened. A cobbler was dragged from his shop for stitching a red thread into a noble's boot, the color of blood, someone said, and that was enough. A midwife disappeared after delivering a stillborn child. It was whispered that her touch had caused a death. In the capital, a scribe was imprisoned for misplacing a comma in a letter to a baron. Not even the baron had noticed, but someone somewhere had, and the punishment was immediate. No trial, no explanation, just the scraping of a key in a dungeon door. People began to fear accidents more than intentions. It wasn't what you meant to do. It was how it might be seen. A sneeze during prayer, a laugh in a moment too still, a word that rhymed unintentionally with something unkind. These were no longer quirks of daily life. They were offenses, crimes, not in a legal sense, but in the newer, deeper sense, crimes against the king's vision of obedience. Public squares grew more crowded, not with markets, but with platforms. Not gallows at first, just wooden stages. A place for punishment, they said, though the word had lost meaning. People were lashed there for smiling too broadly. A woman was made to kneel in silence for 3 days for wearing shoes deemed too fine for her station. An elderly man was forced to carry a sack of stones through the Capitol for forgetting a prayer. The punishments grew creative, arbitrary, performed with flair as though for an audience. And indeed, there was always an audience. The king's guards watched. Sometimes the king himself watched, though never from up close, always from afar. A shadow at the top of the castle steps, a figure at the window, just enough to remind the people that he was there. And the people learned. They learned to live smaller, quieter, more carefully. Words were weighed before they were spoken. Gestures were measured. Clothing was drab. Food was bland. Laughter was rare. Children were taught to speak only when spoken to, and not even then unless entirely necessary. Eyes were kept low. Heads were bowed in greeting, not out of respect, but out of fear. The entire kingdom, it seemed, was waiting for anything to go wrong. The guard became judges in their own right. A nod from one of them could mean 3 days in the pillory. A misinterpreted word could cost a hand. They needed no evidence. No one to speak against you. If you were noticed, that was enough. Better not to be noticed at all. Better to move like mist through the day, to become forgettable, featureless, small. Safety, after all, was found not in virtue, but in invisibility. And yet, even invisibility did not always work, because the punishments were not about the acts. They were about the control, about reminding everyone at all times who held the power to decide. A noble woman was paraded to the Capitol with a chain around her neck. Her crime, possessing a book that once belonged to her grandmother, written in a dialect the king found displeasing. A blacksmith was forced to brand his own hand. The charge unclear, possibly imagined. The punishment was real enough. Worse still were the days when punishment came without even a whisper of wrongdoing. When the king, bored or restless or curious, ordered a name drawn from a list. Just a name. No reason. No context. And that name would be called at dawn, and that person, whoever they were, would be taken. Those who witnessed, it said the guards did not even speak. They knocked once. They entered. They left with the chosen. The town bells did not ring. The skies did not change. But the silence afterward was deeper. And it was not just the body that could be punished. Reputation, livelihood, memory, all became fair game. A baker's name was stricken from the rolls. His children forbidden from attending school. A widow was declared unfit for mourning and ordered to remarry within a fortnight or forfeit her home. A village was labeled suspect and cut off from trade. The cause never explained. These punishments, intangible yet devastating, spread faster than plague. They created a second map of the kingdom, not of land and river, but of fear. The records, once carefully kept by royal historians, began to fracture. Whole pages were left blank. Some events were written in code, as if the scribes feared that writing the truth might summon judgment upon them. Others used vague phrases, disciplinary measures, corrective influence, adjustment to order. The words meant nothing, and everyone knew it, but they filled space. They satisfied the need to pretend that order still existed. Over time, the people stopped speaking a crime altogether. It became a word with no meaning. There was only behavior and the reaction to it. No line could be drawn in the sand, because the sand itself was shifting. The king decided, and that was enough. And through it all, he remained silent. Not once did he issue a speech, nor offer a reason for any punishment. He did not explain. He did not warn. He only watched. And when the time came, as it always did, his hand would lift or his eyes would turn, and that was all the signal anyone needed. A kingdom where no crime was needed to be punished. Only the possibility, the moment, the mood, and that in time became the cruelest law of all. There was a time when the public square had been a place of exchange, of goods, of news, of pleasantries between neighbors. It was where the bread sellers' cries mingled with the jingling of mule harnesses, where the children played at pretend battles between stick-armed heroes and imagined beasts, and where the old men sat beneath the crooked lime trees, trading the same 5 stories, worn smooth by repetition. But that time passed. Slowly, imperceptibly, as the mood of the kingdom blackened and turned inward, the square took on another function. It became a stage, a place of demonstration, of warning, of spectacle, and at its center, blood. It did not begin with executions, but with something more subdued. A man tied to a post for an entire day, under the full sun, his hands bound behind him, a sign draped around his neck. No one knew what he had done. He did not cry out. He only wept, not loudly, just steadily, as the hours passed. The guards made no announcement, and when the sun began to set, they came and cut him free. He stumbled once and walked away. No one ever saw him again, but the crowd remembered. They did not know why he had been punished, and that not knowing worked a deep, unsettling magic on their minds. Soon, the post became permanent. Not one, but 3, then 5, one in every town. Then gallows, not only in the capital, but in even the smaller market villages. They were not used daily at first, but their mere presence altered the rhythm of things. The stalls moved farther away. People stopped lingering. The children no longer played. And then came the announcements, brief, unadorned. There will be a demonstration. No further details. No names, no accusations. Just a time, and the expectation that all should attend. They came, at first, in hesitant clumps, drawn not by curiosity, but by fear of being noticed absent. To not attend was to risk association with the condemned, whatever the charge may be. So they came. They stood in silence. They watched, and when the first executions occurred, there were no cheers, no shouts, no clapping. Just silence. A terrible, heavy silence as the condemned were led to the block, or the rope, or whatever device had been chosen. The methods changed often, perhaps by design, perhaps to keep the people from becoming numb to repetition. It was said the king watched the first few from a high balcony, flanked by his silent advisors. He did not smile. He did not turn away. He simply watched, with the same stillness that had become his signature. Afterward, the bodies were left hanging overnight, then longer. Crows came. Dogs sniffed at the bases of platforms. Children were told not to look, but they always did. You cannot help but look at a thing meant to be hidden. Over time, the executions grew more elaborate. The condemned were made to wear costumes, a jester's cap, a robe of flowers, even once a suit stitched entirely from pages torn from prayer books. The meanings were never explained. Some said the king had taken a personal interest in the symbolism. Others whispered that he left the details to his advisors, who now viewed their gruesome work as a kind of theater. But whether through madness or intention, the performances became grotesque pageants. One man was forced to recite a love poem to a tree before his execution. Another was crowned with wax candles, each one lit, as he was walked to the gallows. None of it made sense. And yet, sense was no longer required. Soon, drums were added, then horns. A band, solemn and off-tune, began to play before each event. Children were told the names of the instruments, as if preparing for a festival. School teachers were ordered to bring their students, so they may understand the consequences of disobedience. The letter said, and so they came, faces pale, hands trembling, eyes wide. The crowd grew younger, and yet somehow more silent. Vendors, unable to resist, returned to the square, but their wares had changed. No longer toys or sweets. Now, ink sketches of the condemned, charcoal renderings of the gallows, figurines carved from bone. For remembrance, the seller said, so we never forget. But their smiles were hollow, and the customers always glanced around before buying, as if unsure whether they were participating in reverence or rebellion. By the end of the second year of the king's reign, the executions had become weekly events. People no longer asked why. The question itself was dangerous. Instead, they wondered whose name would be read aloud in that voice that came from behind a velvet curtain, thick and unfamiliar, as if spoken by no one and everyone at once. It might be a noble, a priest, a merchant, a child. No one was immune. The randomness was the point. It is said that during one summer, a series of performances took place where the condemned were given lines to speak. Short, cryptic monologues written on parchment, delivered before their final moments. Lines like, "I walked the wrong road and saw a black star," or "My hands were never mine to begin with," or "Forgive the silence that led me here." Whether the condemned wrote these lines themselves, or were given them by some court dramatist, no one knows. But they were spoken aloud. Then silence. Then the end. And still the people came. Because they had to. And because, in time, they forgot what it had been like not to come. The public square was no longer a place of life. It was a theater of death. And in a strange, sick way, it filled a void. In a kingdom drained of joy, of freedom, of music and laughter, the executions became the only communal ritual left. A dark mirror of celebration. A shared experience in a land where all other forms of gathering had been outlawed or made impossible. The games, over time, became a tradition. Not recorded, not discussed, but understood, like a curse passed through bloodlines. A ritual performed beneath the skin of the kingdom. And though no town crier ever spoke of them, and no parchment bore their name, everyone knew. Everyone. The butcher in the alley, the beggar by the fountain, the boy in the schoolroom. They all knew. Somewhere deep in the castle, the king was watching, and the games were continuing. Not for justice, not for order, not even for cruelty, but for fun. There was a time, early in the reign, when the queen would walk among the gardens. She moved like mist in the morning, quiet, graceful, never hurried, with pale gloves and a book always tucked beneath one arm. She rarely spoke in public, and when she did, it was with the gentlest voice, like the brushing of silk against glass. The people said she came from the mountains to the east, where the wind was always soft and the summers never too long. Her presence had once brought comfort, a contrast to the king's unnerving stillness. But that presence, like so much else in the kingdom, faded. No one remembers the last time they saw her in sunlight. There had been no announcement, no decoration, no black flags flying from the tower or bells tolling low in mourning. She did not die, at least not officially. She simply ceased. One day, she did not appear at morning prayers. The next, her chariot court was empty. By the end of the week, the garden paths had begun to grow wild, the hedges untended, the fountain still. Her absence was a silence no one dare mention. Whispers, of course, filled the void. Whispers always do. Some said she had gone mad, that the long years beside the king, watching the steady descent into cruelty, had unstrung something delicate inside her mind. They said she was kept now in a room high in the tower, not imprisoned exactly, but removed, cared for by silent nurses, allowed no mirrors, no visitors. Others believed she had fled, disguised herself and slipped out one stormy night, cloaked and barefoot, taking only what she could carry. She had, they said, been seen once on the road to the forest, her pale face hidden beneath a hood, her ring finger bare. But the most persistent whisper, and the one most feared, was this, that she had displeased the king. No one could say how. The queen had never spoken out against his rule. She had never intervened in matters of court, never interfered with policy or punishment. But those who remembered her face from before, from the early days, recalled a faint sadness in her gaze, a kind of mourning, even in moments of peace. Perhaps the king had seen it, too. Perhaps that sadness was enough. A maid who once served in the queen's apartments said that in her final days, the queen had taken to drawing, not with ink or quill, but with charcoal in the margins of old books. Strange things, towers without doors, trees with no leaves, eyes, always eyes, watching from cracks in the walls, from beneath beds, from behind clouds. The drawings were hurried, frantic, as though done in the dark. After she vanished, the king's men removed every one of them, burned the pages, scrubbed the walls. Nothing remained. In the weeks that followed her disappearance, the king appeared more frequently in court, not to speak, never to speak, but to sit, to watch. His robes grew darker, his hair longer. A new ring appeared on his finger, jet black, carved with symbols no one recognized. Some claimed it had belonged to the queen. Others said it was made from something she left behind. Bone, perhaps. Or something older? When he raised his hand, the ring caught no light. It seemed to absorb it. The palace, too, changed in tone. The east wing, once hers, was sealed. Not boarded, but locked with thick iron. Guards were posted, not to keep people out, but to prevent questions. Servants who had worked near the queen were reassigned or dismissed or simply gone. A silence fell over that side of the castle, a silence deeper than stone, heavier than history. It was said that if you walked near those halls at night, you could still hear the faint rustle of skirts, the turning of pages, the weeping of someone long forgotten. Her portraits vanished as well, removed from galleries, from private chambers, from the great tapestries that lined the halls. Where once her face had smiled gently beside the king's, there was now only empty threadwork, a faded outline, the memory of someone erased. One steward, new to the palace, asked about the missing image. He was not seen again. His room was clear before dawn. The queen became a shadow, a name not spoken, a figure only mentioned in hushed tones and behind closed doors, and even then, only in the most guarded company. A noble woman, too drunk on plum wine at a feast, made a careless joke about what happens to disobedient queens. The room went still. The king said nothing. But a week later, her estate was seized. Her son was conscripted. Her name was struck from the rolls. Yet the people remembered. Quietly, in their own way, flowers still appeared at the gates of the old garden. Folded notes tucked beneath stones. Tiny carvings of birds, the queen's favorite, left where only the wind might find them. The gestures were small, meaningless, perhaps, but they endured. And then, one day, a rumor spread to the city like smoke. A woman had been seen near the ruins of the old bell tower, barefoot, her face pale, her hair like frost. She had not spoken. She had not looked at anyone. She had only stood there, hands folded, as if waiting for something. Then, just as suddenly, she had vanished into the mist. The guards denied it. The court denied it. The king made no comment. But that night, the tower was struck by lightning. The next morning it collapsed. No one rebuilt it. In time, the queen became something else. Not a person, but a story. A presence that lingered, unseen but deeply felt. Children were told she was watching, not as a threat, but as a comfort. Behave, they were told, so the queen will not worry. Her name, never spoken aloud, was etched in lullabies, in carved initials, in dreams. A ghost, perhaps, or a memory too stubborn to die. And somewhere in the castle, perhaps in a sealed chamber or behind a false wall, a single book may still remain, its pages brittle, its ink faded, and in its margins, the faint outline of eyes, watching, waiting. They were always there, though few could recall exactly when it had first appeared. The throne room had seen many advisors over the years, some young and eager, others old and stooped with years of counsel. But these three were different. They arrived without ceremony, without name, without history. No titles preceded them, and no origins were offered. They simply took their place behind the king one morning, robed in heavy black garments, stitched with thread the color of ash. Their faces were obscured by deep cowls, shadows hiding every feature save the occasional glint of an eye beneath the folds. From that day onward, they never left. They stood silently at the edges of the king's presence, unmoving, unspeaking, as constant as the stone columns that supported the hall. In the early days, courtiers thought them ornamental, a strange fashion of the king's design, a show of mystery or menace. But then decisions began to shift. Policies changed. Sentences grew more brutal. And always, just before a decree was enacted, one of the three would lean slightly forward, as if whispering, though no words were ever heard. The king would remain silent, nod once, and the matter would be decided. They were never seen outside of the throne room. They did not attend feasts or festivals or funerals. They did not ride with the royal processions. They had no names on the palace ledger, no chambers assigned to them. Servants who tried to follow them after court hours found only empty halls or doorways that led nowhere. One page claimed to have seen one of the advisors enter a wall. Not a door, but a wall itself, as though it had opened like cloth to receive them. The page was gone the next day. No one mentioned his name again. What disturbed people most about the advisors, however, was not what they did, but what they recorded. Each carried a small leather-bound volume, chained to their belts by silver links. Within these books, they wrote constantly, not with goose-feathered quills, but with sharpened iron nibs that scratched across the parchment like claws. They wrote without looking down, their eyes fixed on the court, their hands moving in perfect unison, as if transcribing some invisible voice that only they could hear. The sound was faint. Scratch, 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 like insects beneath the floorboards. Courtiers swore they could hear it even after they left the room, in their dreams, in the still hours of the night. What they wrote, no one knew. The volumes were never opened to others. Some believed the books contained judgments, lists of names, future punishments, secret laws. Others thought they were records of court's every word and gesture, a ledger of loyalty and betrayal. A few whispered that the books did not record what was, but what would be, that the advisors were not of this world, but something older, something from the dark corners of the land's forgotten past. Their influence grew, though no word was ever spoken. Ministers who once argued freely in court now fell silent under the advisors' gaze. Even the nobles began to dress more conservatively, speak more cautiously, avoid eye contact with those three unmoving figures. The atmosphere of court became suffocating, like a room sealed too tightly, the air stale and thick with dread. It was not the king's wrath they feared most. It was the quiet lean of a cowled head, the scratch of a pen upon parchment, the slow turning of a page. On rare occasions, one of the advisors would point. No words, no gesture beyond a single skeletal finger emerging from the folds of their robe, extended toward a person in the court. And without fail, that person would be removed. Sometimes within moments, sometimes days later. But always they vanished. Their lands were seized, their names erased, their portraits, if any existed, removed from family homes. Even the stonemasons ceased carving their names into ancestral tombs. It was as though they had never existed. One winter, the king ordered a feast for mid-solstice. Lavish, bright, full of warmth and wine and roasted game. The court dared to laugh again, however briefly, their voices rising in the vaulted hall like the flicker of a dying candle. And for a moment, it seemed as if the advisors had not come that evening. Their usual place beside the throne stood empty. But as the first course was served, they appeared, not from the doors, but already seated at the high table. No one had seen them enter. They did not eat. They did not drink. They only watched. And as the feast continued, one of them began to write. By morning, 3 nobles were found dead in their chambers. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Just an ink-stained parchment resting on each of their chests, marked with a symbol no one could translate. After that, no more feasts were held in winter. Over time, the kingdom scholars tried to uncover the origins of these shadowy figures. Old scrolls were unsealed. Ancient texts were consulted, and in a book older than most churches, one name appeared again and again, the 3 witnesses. They were mentioned only in fragments, always as observers, never as actors. They see what is hidden, one line read. They record what the world refuses to admit. Another. When the witnesses walk, kings do not rule. They are ruled. The discovery was never made public. The scholars who found it died of sudden illness. The library where the book had been stored burned to ground 3 nights later. And so, the silent advisors remained, unmoving, unaging, unchallenged. People no longer wondered who they were, or where they came from, or what they wanted. They only wondered when they would look at them, when that cold, inhuman gaze would settle upon their face, when the pages would begin to turn with sudden speed, when the scratching of the iron pens would quicken, and what would be written in ink or in blood. In the end, they became more feared than the king himself. For the king was a man, and men can be understood, but the advisors were something else. They were the watchers in the dark, the scribes of doom, the silent ones who never spoke, because they had no need to. The kingdom had learned long ago. The most terrifying voice is the one that does not speak at all. It did not happen all at once. The hush settled over the kingdom the way dust settles in an abandoned room. slowly, invisibly, until every surface is coated, and the only sound left is the whisper of your own breath. There had been noise once, of course, in the years before the king's gaze grew cold and long, before the games and the gallows and the silent watchers. There had been song in the fields and shouts in the markets. Doors slammed, bells rang, wheels clattered on stone, and children shrieked with a strange joy that only the young can understand. But those noises had begun to die, one by one, like candles extinguished in a long, drafty corridor. At first, it was simple things. People spoke less in the streets. Conversations that once lingered became hurried, clipped. Pleasantries were reduced to nods. Compliments were received with suspicion. Laughter became a private act, muffled into sleeves, buried beneath handkerchiefs. The loudest people vanished first. The barkers, the gossipers, the balladeers. Their absence wasn't announced. Their homes simply stood empty. Their stalls, once full of color and clamor, were boarded in silence. Then came the decrees, not loud, booming orders from the palace steps, but quiet edicts, whispered through town criers who now wore black gloves and never looked up. Rules about noise, about behavior, about discretion. Voices must be kept beneath the level of respect. No shouting after dusk. No songs within city walls unless pre-approved. Children to be seen but not heard. These were the new expectations, carved not in stone, but into the minds of the people. Disobedience was rare. Punishment, as always, was swift. Musicians were the next to go. At first, they tried to adapt. Softer strings, gentler flutes, lyrics so tame they bordered on nonsense. But even those efforts proved too much. A fiddler once played a melody so soft it was mistaken for birdsong. He was arrested before the final note. A boy caught humming, while sweeping was made to stand barefoot on cold stone until he forgot the tune. Choirs dissolved. Drums fell silent. The sound of celebration became memory. Even the churches began to change. The sermons shortened. The hymns vanished. Incense still burned, but the bells no longer rang. Priests spoke in whispers. Prayers were mouthed, not spoken. It was said that in one cathedral, the very walls began to weep, not with water or oil, but with the faint echoes of all the voices that had once sung beneath its arches. The bishop had them scraped clean. The next day, he was found sitting in the pulpit, eyes open, mouth closed, heart stilled. In taverns, mugs were slid across tables instead of clinked. Toasts were made with nods. The crackle of fire replaced the sound of stories. Patrons drank in near darkness, and bartenders learned to read lips better than any scribe. A single misplaced word could mean the end of the evening, or the end of the tavern itself. No one risked it. Even the drunk knew how to stay quiet. Weddings became mimed ceremonies, where the vows were written on parchment and read silently by the couple. Funerals were attended in silence, the dirges replaced by long stares and the rustle of mourning veils. Children's games turned from noisy tag and riddles to stone stacking and long, motionless staring contests. Festivals became parades of faces, not voices. No dancers, no chants, just a quiet shuffle of feet and the ever-present fear of being too loud. And within the castle, the epicenter of it all, the silence was a kind of god. Even the guards did not speak. Orders were conveyed with gestures. Meals were eaten in near total quiet, broken only by the clink of cutlery on stone. When the king entered a room, the air seemed to compress. The silence grew thicker, almost audible, a presence you could feel in your chest. Servants moved like shadows, barely daring to breathe. And those who made mistakes, a dropped plate, a stubbed toe, an involuntary cough, were removed, not punished, not berated, just removed, taken somewhere unseen, from which no sound ever returned. It was said the king had developed an aversion to sound, that he found noise offensive, or perhaps unbearable, but others whispered something darker, that silence had become his language, that in the absence of words, of song, of laughter, he could hear something else, something deeper, the truth beneath the noise, the secrets people kept even from themselves, and that, in this total stillness, he could finally rule not just the bodies of his people, but their thoughts. This was not an empire built on blood, though there had been blood enough, nor was it built on law, which had become a distant memory. It was built on silence, on the careful, permanent erasure of voice, a quiet so deep, even dreams began to lose their sounds. People woke with mouths open, unsure what had frightened them. Children learned to cry without tears, only by holding their breath and trembling. Mothers rocked them without lullabies. Fathers pointed instead of calling. And in that silence, something shifted. Time seemed to slow. The days grew longer, the nights heavier. Without the chatter of life, the world took on a strange stillness, as though the kingdom itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, hoping for nothing, existing only in the pause between sound and sound. Birds still sang beyond the forest, but fewer people ventured far enough to hear them. Rivers still murmured in the hills, but those murmurings seemed foreign now, too wild, too free. Within the kingdom's borders, silence had become the truest loyalty, and to break it, even accidentally, was to challenge the crown. In the end, the people did not need to be told. They knew, instinctively, like animals who sense a coming storm. They understood that survival lay not in defiance, but in stillness, in a voice never raised, in footsteps soft and careful, in closing the shutters and speaking only in the mind. For in the kingdom of the Mad King, silence was not merely a law. It was a throne upon which he ruled. The kingdom had once boasted many cities. Not grand, perhaps, not the sort sung of in foreign courts or etched in golden maps, but proud in their way, built from stone and timber, cradled between rivers and hills, each with its own rhythm, its own voice. There were cities of cobbled bridges, where fishermen shouted greetings at dawn, cities of markets, of ink-stained scribes, of glassmakers who spoke in riddles while spinning molten sand into colored light, cities where bells rang in harmony, where goats wandered lanes, where schoolchildren recited poetry beneath ivy-covered arches. Each had its place in the quiet pulse of the kingdom, but under the rule of the Mad King, the cities began to vanish, not in the blaze of war or sweep of plague, or the fury of fire and flood. No banners fell, no walls crumbled. They vanished quietly, one by one, as though pulled beneath the skin of the earth by invisible hands. It began with shutters. In the first city to vanish, traders noticed that the windows were closed more often than not. The markets grew thin. Stalls were left unclaimed. The baker, who once sang to his loaves, stopped opening his shop at all. Doors creaked open for only a crack, enough for a pair of wary eyes, a few whispered words, then closed again. Visitors arrived and found themselves unwelcome, not with hostility but with absence. There was no one to greet them, no one to guide them, just long streets, empty save for the wind. Soon, the streets themselves emptied. The taverns closed. The schools stopped teaching. The bells stopped ringing. One day, a caravan arrived to trade, spices and wool and fine tools from the outer marches. They found the gates wide open, but no guards. No people, no sounds, just buildings, intact but lifeless, standing like tombstones in perfect silence. Not a single cat, not a single bird. The caravan left before nightfall. When a second group returned weeks later, the roads had grown over. Vines had begun to creep across the stone. The city was still there, but less real, a sketch fading from the page. The king made no statement. The court offered no explanation. Maps were not amended. Couriers who tried to speak of it were ignored. It was as though the city had never existed. And then it happened again. A second city, one known for its great water wheels and its painted boats, began to dim. First, the color drained from its sails. Then, the wheels stopped turning. No one saw them stop. They were simply still one morning, the water flowing past them like it no longer recognized them. The fishmongers vanished. The ferrymen stopped ferrying. Even the fish began to disappear from the riverbanks, their scales dull, their eyes glassy. People spoke of a silence heavier than sound. They said the air felt thick there, like walking through water, that their thoughts grew sluggish the longer they remained. Some wept without knowing why. Others grew angry at nothing. Most left and did not return. By the third city, the people understood, though no one said it aloud. There was a pattern, a rhythm, not a destruction, but of erasure. It was not death that claimed the cities. It was forgetting. Cities that did not speak loud enough, that did not cheer or protest, or weep loudly enough to be noticed. Cities that slipped beneath the attention of the crown, or perhaps precisely into its gaze. There was no announcement, no smoke on the horizon, just a thinning, a stilling, a pause that never ended. One town attempted to resist. Its leaders ordered loud celebrations, music in the streets, speeches from rooftops, plays performed every evening. Bells were rung at all hours. Drums pounded. Children shouted gleefully. For a week, the town shimmered with sound. And then the king's men came, not with fire, not with swords. They simply arrived at dusk, walked the perimeter of the city, and left at dawn. The following week, every bell in town cracked. The drums split. The actors lost their voices. The children refused to speak. Even the dogs stopped barking. By the end of the month, the city was quiet once more. And 3 weeks after that, gone. It wasn't that the buildings vanished. They remained. Walls, windows, wells, all intact. But something deeper faded. The spirit, the motion, the memory. Travelers who passed through would pause, frown, and move on, unable to say what felt wrong. Like walking through a dream just before waking, familiar and distant, textured yet unreal. Scholars, before they too vanished, tried to chart the disappearances. They noted that it was not just noise the cities lacked, but distinction. Cities that tried too hard to be unseen, to remain safe by silence, were the first to go, but those that made too much sound followed soon after. It was not about volume, they theorized, but visibility. The king, they suspected, could not abide those who stepped too far in either direction. Neither the bold nor the quiet could escape his gaze. Only those in balance, trembling perfectly on the line between known and forgotten, endured. One city, on the edge of the northern forests, took a different approach. It erased itself preemptively, covered its signs, dismantled its watchtowers, painted every house gray. They spoke only in gestures, walked only at night, never wrote their names. They tried, with method and patience, to become invisible. It worked for a time, and then the forest took them, not with malice, but with moss. No one knows how many cities are gone now. The maps remain unchanged, but the roads to certain places feel longer, less certain. You walk, and the sun never quite shifts in the sky. The trees all look the same. The milestones bear no names. And when you turn back, the way is shorter than you remember. Some say the cities still exist, just beneath the veil, sleeping, waiting for a time when names will be safe again. Others say they were never real, that the king in his madness rewrote history so thoroughly that the earth obeyed. But the people remember, not in words, not in books, but in the way they hesitate before naming a place, the way they glance down certain roads and feel their steps grow heavy, the way a chill passes through a crowd at the mention of a market that no one can quite locate. The cities are gone, but their absence is louder than any song. There was a forest at the edge of the kingdom, a vast and ancient one, older than the roads, older than the borders, older, some said, than memory itself. It had no name, or rather, too many. The locals once called it Veldenwald, the folded wood, for its layers of mist and trees that seemed to double back on themselves. Others referred to it as the Deep March, or the Still Grove, or simply that place. But by the time of the Mad King's full descent into quiet tyranny, no name for the forest remained. Only a vague gesture toward the horizon, a half-spoken word, followed by silence. It was not always feared. In gentler years, hunters ventured into its lower paths for deer and boar. Children dared one another to step beneath its shadowy canopy. Gatherers plucked berries from its edge, laughing as they filled their baskets. It was a place of uncertainty, yes, the trees too thick, the birds too quiet, the moss thick on every stone. But not malice, not dread, not yet. Then the cities began to vanish, and slowly the forest began to grow, not wildly, not in a rush of roots and creeping vines, but steadily, patiently, as if it had been waiting for something. The boundary stones that once marked the edge of civilization began to tilt. Roads once straight curled slightly inward. Trees pushed through fence lines, through cobblestones, through doorways. Houses near the edge began to rot faster. Their wood swelled and split. Mold crept from the floorboards. Foundations sank. Families moved inland. Those who stayed began to speak less, or not at all. No one knew if the forest itself moved or if the world around it shrank. But maps change, not officially, not on parchment, but in practice. Waypoints were relocated. Distances lengthened. One day a bridge would cross a stream. The next, it would end in roots and shadow. Villages once a half-day's journey away became unreachable in daylight. Trees whispered now, though the wind did not blow. Paths twisted even when the travelers swore they walked straight. A few tried to chart the new boundaries. A cartographer, once employed by the royal court, set off a mule and 3 assistants to measure the encroaching edge. He marked trees, laid string, carved arrows into stone. For 3 days, he reported progress. On the 4th, the report stopped. A week later, the mule returned alone, bearing only a single sheet of parchment in its saddle pouch. It bore a map unfinished, scrawled in haste. The lines curved like spirals, the landmarks replaced by eyes and teeth. Across the bottom, in a trembling hand, was written, "It breathes." From then on, people spoke of the forest not as a place, but as a presence, something that watched. It became law, unwritten but absolute, that no one entered the forest past a certain point. A ring of stones was placed along the last road, carved with warnings in the old tongue. Not even soldiers crossed it. Those who did, even in pursuit of criminals or game, were never seen again. Or worse, were seen once, returned wrong. A farmer's son entered one spring morning, chasing a lost lamb. He came back at dusk, covered in mud, smiling too widely, saying nothing. He stood at the edge of the village until dawn, then walked back into the woods and was not followed. Still, the forest offered no attack. No marching trees or strangling vines. Just a steady, relentless advance of stillness. Homes near the edge filled with fog, even in clear weather. Wells ran dry. Cattle refused to graze in nearby fields. The birds, once gone, never returned. It was said, quietly, behind locked doors, that the king no longer slept in the castle, but had moved his chambers to a high tower built on the old borderlands, where he could see the edge of the forest each morning. That he stood at dawn in silence, watching it, waiting. Some said he believed the forest spoke to him, that it hummed just beneath the wind, a song only he could hear. Others whispered that the forest was punishment, not his, but for him, that it was not growing toward the kingdom, but toward him. And still, the forest crept forward. A village that once lay 5 miles from its edge found itself swallowed within a year. The church bells rang once, sharply, then no more. The graves were found empty, the headstones blank. A traveler passed through and said the houses stood like shells, untouched but hollow. No birds, no insects, no footprints in the dust. One day, a great bell rang from the heart of the forest. Just once, low and deep, like iron dropped into a well. It came from no known tower, from no place that maps had ever marked. After that, no one spoke of going near the edge again. Some began to believe the forest was not a place at all, but an idea, a silence so deep it could take form, that it was not made of trees and moss, but a forgetting, that the more the kingdom fell into hush and fear and muttered half-words, the stronger the forest became. It fed not on roots or soil, but on absence, on the disappearance of voices, on the void left behind when memory died. In time, the forest was no longer spoken of, not because people forgot, but because forgetting was safer. And so it remained, at the edge of vision, at the edge of maps, at the edge of thought, a place not of danger, but of inevitability, not death, but erasure, a place that did not need to hunt, because everything eventually came to it. It began as most strange things do, with something small, a crack, a whisper, a reflection that did not quite follow its master. Long before the mirror plague was given a name, people began to notice that something was not right with their glass. Not all glass, not the kind in windows or goblets or lanterns, only mirrors, just the ones that showed your face. At first, it was passed off as wear or tricks of the eye or poor craftsmanship, a shimmer in the corner, a delay in motion, a flicker of something unfamiliar in what should have been a perfect copy. Then one day, a noble woman smashed her dressing mirror with the heel of her boot. She claimed it had smiled at her, not her own smile, but another, slow and deliberate, beginning at the corners and rising without reason. When she turned to check her face, it was still, but in the mirror, it smiled. Just for a second, just long enough. Her servants were called. They dismissed her fears, brought a new glass, and 2 days later, she threw herself from the tower. The new mirror was found shattered beside her, its surface webbed with cracks like a frozen pond. The guard said it looked as though something had struck from the inside. That might have been the end of it, but more cases followed. Slowly at first, isolated. A blacksmith refused to shave after claiming his reflection whispered to him. A child was found staring into a spoon's polished surface for hours, repeating words no one else could hear. A nun in a distant convent painted over every reflective surface with tar, claiming they showed her the faces of people who had never lived. Or perhaps had lived, but elsewhere long ago. The king issued no decree. He never did, but the palace mirrors were quietly removed, one by one, covered with cloth and taken away by hooded attendants who did not speak. They were not destroyed, simply stored, in a chamber no one visited, behind a door that had no keyhole. Still, the mirror plague spread. It was not an illness in the traditional sense. No fevers, no boils, no bleeding. It spread not by contact, but by attention, by curiosity. It affected those who looked too long, those who stared when they should have glanced, those who sought meaning in their reflection or recognition or answers. What they saw, what they thought they saw, varied. A blink when none occurred, a movement lagging behind, a mouth forming a word you had not spoken. At first, victims tried to ignore it. They avoided mirrors, turned them to the wall, draped them in cloth. But the reflections returned, in puddles, in polished stone, in the glint of a dagger. The face would wait, and if you looked too long, you'd see it watching you. There were those who claimed the reflections were not malicious, that they were trying to communicate, that they were not copies, but others, a different you, trapped, perhaps, or born in the glass, or drawn into it by something older than the kingdom itself. These thinkers did not live long. One was found with shards of mirror embedded in her skin, not from violence, but as though she had tried to become a reflection, to step through, to join. Over time, the phenomena changed. Reflections stopped mimicking. They began to move on their own. Some would turn their heads when you did not. Others would remain still when you paced. Worst of all were the moments, rare but remembered, when a reflection would turn away slowly, deliberately, and look at something behind you. No one ever found what it saw. A few brave souls attempted to experiment. A scholar tied himself to a chair, placed a mirror across the room, and sat for 12 hours staring into it. He documented every detail, every twitch, every shift, every moment of divergence. On the final page of his journal, he wrote, "It knows I'm watching." He disappeared the next day. The mirror was cracked cleanly down the middle, and his chairs found on the ceiling, nailed there upside down. One by one, mirrors were banned. Quietly, traders stopped bringing them. Glassmakers who crafted them found their kills cold in the morning. Entire villages removed every reflective surface. People learned to live without seeing their own faces. Hairstyles became simpler, clothing unadorned. No one asked how they looked. No one wanted to know, but the plague did not vanish, because it had never been about the mirrors. It was about what looked back in the lower crypt of the old cathedral. There's a carving older than the stone itself. It shows a figure looking into a pool, its reflection reaching up toward it. Not a copy, but a twin. Its eyes are blank. Its smile wrong. The reflection is closer than the original, almost stepping through. No one knows who carved it. No one knows what it means. But the priests have placed thick cloths over it, and no one prays there now. The Mad King, it is said, still keeps one mirror. Small, oval, framed in bone, kept in a drawer no one dares open. They say he consults it on nights when the sky is black and no stars shine. They say he whispers to it. They say it answers. But no one knows, because no one dares to look. The mirror plague is not over. It cannot be ended. Because every time someone glances into a pane of glass, or the smooth side of a blade, or the surface of still water, it waits, patient, silent, smiling. And if you linger too long, it remembers. There came a point in the kingdom's long descent into silence when even the laws were no longer written. Not erased, not quite. They were still there in some sense, but they changed shape, first in tone, then in presence, and finally in memory. It was not that the laws ceased to exist, but that they became unspoken. No proclamations were made. No scrolls unfurled in public squares. No town criers bellowed their contents beneath balconies. The last law to be formally announced was a simple one. Let what is known remain known. Let what is spoken be remembered. After that, nothing further was said. Nothing needed to be. People learn the new laws not through words, but through consequence. The earliest of these quiet rules concern names. A child's name, once a point of pride and celebration, became something to be handled with care. To speak it aloud in public was to invite attention, not admiration, not affection, but scrutiny. It was safer to use gestures, glances, or vague terms of endearment. Parents began calling their children the small one, or my shadow, or simply you. Names became secrets shared only in whispers, locked in memories behind closed doors. Then there was the law of destinations. You could no longer ask someone where they were going. You could follow them if you dared, but you could not name the place. People stopped giving directions. Maps, once sketched into dirt by helpful strangers, were wiped clean. Even when someone asked for help, locals would only shake their heads slowly or point in broad, uncertain sweeps. It wasn't that they didn't know. They had simply learned that some knowledge, once spoken aloud, spoiled, or summoned. This new body of law did not replace the old. It overlaid it. A second darker skin of silence stretched across the bones of the written code. The parchment laws still existed in dusty archives and locked chests, consulted now and then by trembling scribes who pretended the pages still held authority. But everyone knew the truth. What mattered was not what had been written, but what was never said. The punishments, too, were never described. You only knew when someone had broken the law by their sudden absence, or worse, by their transformation. A cheerful woman who once greeted everyone by name now sat quietly in her doorway, eyes unfocused, muttering only half-formed syllables. A merchant who had once recited prices aloud to customers now pointed mutely to a slate with numbers scratched in charcoal. Those who once made jokes found their voices brittle, as though each word turned to dust on their tongues. The king's enforcers did not arrest in the traditional sense. They did not wear colors or insignias. They did not carry scrolls or deliver speeches. They simply appeared, unannounced, unspeaking, and waited until the offender fell silent. Some claimed they didn't even move, that they simply stood near you, unmoving, until you forgot what you had said, until you forgot how to speak at all. One of the most feared of these unspoken laws was a rule regarding questions. It happened gradually. At first, people avoided questions out of caution. Too many inquiries led to too many vanished friends. But in time, the habit became a reflex. Questions meant curiosity, and curiosity meant visibility. To ask was to be noticed, and to be noticed was to be counted. Counted by whom, no one could say, only that it did not end well. So the people stopped asking. Instead, they spoke in statements, observations, hints. If someone said, "It is dark today," they might really mean, "Are you afraid?" If someone muttered, "The bread is thinner than yesterday," it could be a plea. "Is your family starving too?" Communication became a dance of silence and implication, a strange form of honesty built not on clarity, but evasion. Even body language took on layered meanings. A tap of the left foot meant, "Do not speak here." A glance to the skies signaled, "They are listening." A slow breath of the nose meant, I remember what you said, but I won't repeat it. These signals change constantly, and fall behind the shifting code was to be isolated or worse, misunderstood. The law of the unspoken was never enforced with chains or swords. It did not need to be. Its power lay in the anticipation of punishment, the chilling certainty that something would happen, even if no one could say what. And in time, that expectation bent the people more than any decree. Fear did what proclamations could not. It rewrote the rules inside their heads. Children born during this era learned not to cry loudly. They learned to nod instead of speak, to memorize gestures before words. In school, such as schools still existed, lessons were conducted through diagrams and silent pointing. History was not taught because the past had too many names. Science was discouraged because it asked too many questions. Language itself began to atrophy, like an unused limb, until most conversations became a soft murmur of acknowledgement, a dull echo of what had once been said. The law eventually seeped into dreams. People awoke with the sense that they had violated something in their sleep, that they had spoken a name, asked a forbidden thing, revealed a memory. They would sit up, breath shallow, waiting to hear the footsteps that never came, but might. One night, in the heart of the capital, a man stood on a barrel and shouted. No one remembers what he said, or even if he said anything at all, but he opened his mouth and sound came out. Real sound, loud, echoing. A word, perhaps, or just a cry. People froze. The air itself seemed to flinch. The man was not removed, not immediately. He stood there, panting, defiant. Then he stepped down, walked home, and locked his door. In the morning, every door on his street was gone. Not broken. Gone. Walled over as if they had never been there. The street was silent. The houses empty. His home, too, was sealed, a windowless cube, blank as stone. To this day, that row remains untouched. Not abandoned. Not reclaimed. Just avoided. And still, the law is unspoken. There are no books, no courts, no trials. Just the understanding that to speak wrongly, or speak at all, is to risk everything. In the kingdom of the Mad King, law is not taught. It is absorbed, passed like a chill through the bones, breathed like smoke in the air. And once it enters you, it never leaves. No one could quite say when the night stopped ending. It was not a sudden thing, not a catastrophe, not an eclipse, not a storm that covered the sun with soot and smoke. It was subtler than that, slower, like the dimming of a candle that burns a little lower each day, unnoticed, until you look up and realize it's gone out completely. At first, it was just a longer dusk. The sun lingered behind the clouds a little longer. Shadows stretched themselves across the earth earlier than expected. Birds grew restless before the usual time, nesting before their songs had finished. Candles were lit in homes while the sky still held a trace of gold. People shrugged it off, as people do. A trick of the weather, they said. A season turning strangely. The king's astronomers, what few remained, said nothing. They simply closed their domes and sealed their towers. Then the dawns began to vanish. Not all at once, just a few days without sunrise. Then more. Then consecutive mornings that remained wrapped in darkness, until people no longer expected the light. There were no roosters crowing, no gradual blue at the edge of the sky, just a continuous velvet black canopy above, pressed low and heavy against the rooftops. They called it the long night at first, some with dread, some with hope, believing it temporary, a strange weather pattern perhaps, or a curse that might lift. But weeks passed, then months, and the stars, which once provided comfort, became something else. They shimmered oddly now, as if rearranging themselves in patterns too vast to read. The moon, too, changed, sometimes appearing full for days on end, then vanishing for a fortnight. No cycle remained. The darkness was not complete. Lanterns still burned, hearts still glowed, but the sky remained a deep, unbroken well. And with each passing day, the flame seemed to fight harder for its place. Torches that once lasted the night burned out early. Candles flickered in still air. Oil lamps sputtered as if choking on something unseen. And then the dreams began. They were vivid, more real than waking life. filled with memories that weren't your own, places you had never visited, faces that shifted and watched. Some dreams lasted days, even weeks, in the mind of the sleeper. They would wake, drenched in sweat, unsure what year it was, and always, there was a sound of footsteps behind them, slow, deliberate, approaching. Sleep itself became dangerous, but so did wakefulness. People began to lose their sense of time. Was it the second night, or the 17th? Did you eat this morning or last week? A man wandered into the village square with a loaf of bread in his hands, and wept because he could no longer remember how to chew. A woman gave birth and refused to name her child, certain that to give a name in eternal darkness was to curse it. Clocks stopped mattering. Bells rang without reason. The idea of hours became laughable. There were only moments now, strung together like beads on a cord, with no way to tell where one ended and the next began. The king said nothing. No royal decree was issued. No torchlit speech from the palace balcony. But it was said in soft tones by those who dared to speak, that he welcomed the darkness, that he walked the palace halls at all hours now, clad in robes the color of smoke, his crown gleaming faintly beneath the torches that always bent slightly away from him, that he spoke to the shadows, and that they answered. Some claimed to have seen him on the castle ramparts, standing perfectly still, his arms outstretched, his eyes closed, as though embracing something only he could feel. The guards, those who remained, watched him from afar. None dared approach, not even to offer light. Religion faltered. Priests had always spoken of light, of dawn as a symbol, of the rising sun as proof of renewal, of rebirth. But what does one preach when the sun no longer comes? The great temples emptied. The altars went cold. One high priest, defiant until the end, lit 1,000 candles and declared the light would bring back the morning. The flames burned for 3 days. On the 4th, the wax was untouched, but the priest's body was gone. Only his sandals remained, neatly placed before the altar, as though he had stepped forward into something unseen. And still the darkness deepened. It was not a malevolent thing. Not exactly. It did not attack or press or howl. It simply was. A presence. An awareness. A waiting. The animals understood. Dogs refused to leave their dens. Birds, where they still existed, did not sing. Even insects, those eternal companions of night, seemed to hush their wings. In the towns, people adjusted. Night markets became the new day. Children played in torchlight, their laughter soft and strange. Crops, those that still grew, were harvested by feel and memory. Songs became lullabies. Work slowed. Sleep fractured. Life continued, but differently, like a dream that never quite made sense, but that you accepted simply because you could not wake. One scholar suggested that the sun had not vanished at all, that it still rose each morning, just beyond a veil, a curtain that had been drawn between the kingdom and the sky, and that the king, in his madness or his clarity, had pulled it close himself. Why, none could say. To protect? To punish? Or simply because he preferred the dark? Others whispered of older things, of bargains struck long ago, of a king who once gazed into a mirror and was promised the silence he so craved, in exchange for the light he never wanted, of a world slowly turning inward, folding into shadow, not as a curse, but as an answer. Whatever the reason, one truth remained. The night had come, and it would not leave. People stopped asking when the sun would return. They stopped looking east in hope. They stopped lighting candles in windows. Instead, they adapted, and somewhere, deep in the palace, the Mad King smiled, because the kingdom no longer marked time, and in the absence of time, there could be no end. Only now, only night, only silence. It was called a celebration, though no one could quite say what was meant to celebrate. The invitation, when they came, were unsigned and unsealed. They arrived beneath doorways and between shutters, tucked into the folds of coats or slipped silently onto tables when no one was looking. The ink was always the same, faded gray, almost indistinguishable from the parchment itself, and the word simple: you are summoned to the feast. Attendance is honored, absence is remembered. There was no date, no time, just a location, the palace. Not a specific hall, not a chamber or gallery. Simply the palace. And those who received the note found, inevitably, that the next path they walked led them there, whether they intended it or not. The palace itself had long been a place of murmurs and mist. By the time of the feast, its windows had been shuttered for years, its doors locked not by bolts, but by silence. The gates opened only for those invited, and they never opened the same way twice. One might arrive by bridge, another through a cellar, another still through a hallway that did not exist before nightfall. But all found themselves, in the end, in the same room. It was enormous and endless, a hall of feasting tables that stretched in every direction, farther than vision allowed. No walls, no ceiling, or perhaps the walls were simply too far to see, and the ceiling too high. Candles floated in the air, their flames unmoving, their light golden but hollow, casting shadows that did not belong to any object. The tables were dressed in deep red cloth, embroidered with symbols none could decipher. Upon them, food, more food than anyone could eat, piled high in silver bowls and on golden platters, meats roasted and steaming, fruits gleaming with dew, loaves warm and fragrant, jugs of wine the color of rubies, goblets chilled with unseen ice, pies filled with spiced air and dreams. Every dish familiar and strange, nostalgic and unsettling, as though crafted from memory rather than recipe. The guests came dressed in their finest, or rather, in what they remembered to be finest, some in noble garb a century out of date, others in rags polished to shine, others still in garments stitched from silence and sleep. They did not speak, but they nodded, smiled, raised glasses. Music played somewhere, soft and slow, the melody familiar to no one yet oddly comforting, like a lullaby hummed in childhood then forgotten. No host appeared, no king at the head table, no herald, no toast, just the food, the guests, and the feast. At first, most were cautious. They took small portions, watched one another, whispered without sound. But hunger, real or imagined, grew louder, and the longer one sat, the harder it became to resist. The food never cooled, never diminished. For each slice taken, two more appeared. Plates refilled themselves the moment they were empty. Wine flowed in a stream that knew no bottom. And so they ate, and they ate, and they did not stop. Some claimed they had been there for days, others weeks. A few could no longer remember their lives before the feast. Only the scent of roast fowl, the feel of warm bread, the clink of silver against porcelain. Time moved differently there. A nap might last a minute or a year. A meal might be a lifetime. No one grew thin, but none grew full either. Once, a man rose from the table, declaring he had had enough. He walked, confidently, toward where he thought the door had been. He passed rows and rows of guests, all feasting, all smiling, slowly. He passed pillars that did not cast shadows, windows that looked out into mirrors, and a chandelier made entirely of bones. He walked for hours. He returned to the table silently, sat down and resumed eating. Others tried different routes, crawling beneath the tables, climbing onto them, singing to the ceiling. One guest tried to burn her invitation, only to find it reappeared inside her goblet, ink untouched. Another whispered her true name, a secret she had kept even from her mother, into the salt cellar. The salt turned black. Her teeth began to fall out. She did not speak again. Eventually, no one tried to leave. They simply ate. Some grew slower. Their movements dulled. Their eyes unfocused. Forks lifted mechanically. Chewing became a kind of rhythm, like breathing. It was said that a man at the far end of the table had not blinked in over a week, that the woman beside him had stopped chewing long ago, but the food still vanished from her plate. There were no children. None were invited. But sometimes a small laugh would echo down the endless rows, a soft giggle, just at the edge of hearing, and everyone would pause, just briefly, before continuing their meal. The food changed subtly with time. Meats became more tender, more delicate, until the texture was less flesh than memory. Fruits glistened like tears. Bread crumbled like old parchment. Wine thickened, grew darker. The flavors became more abstract. The taste of regret, of home long gone, of names forgotten, of roads never taken. Each bite was a history. Each swallow, a surrender. No one knew how many feasts had been held before this one, or how many guests still remained. Some claimed the table stretched through time itself, that to eat was to be folded into the king's memory, that each guest was a moment he chose to remember, or forget. Some believed they were being preserved, not in flesh, but in ritual, that the feast itself was a kind of prayer, endlessly offered to a god that no longer listened, or perhaps had never existed. Still, the plates remained full, the goblets raised, the music played, and at the far end of the table, so distant that no guest could see him, it was said that the mad king sat, alone, smiling, unmoving, his plate untouched, because he had already eaten all he needed. And now he watched. There was once a throne, carved from a single block of obsidian dragged from the depths of a mountain no longer named. It stood at the center of the throne room, a room built not for comfort or ceremony, but for memory. Its walls were tall, cold, and without windows. The air did not move there. Dust never settled. The light, when it came, arrived from nowhere and touched nothing. For generations, the throne was rarely empty. Monarchs sat upon it in times of war, in hours of peace, during weddings and plagues, famines and festivals. It was said that to warm the stone with one's spine was to carry the weight of the realm itself. Its guilt, its secrets, its unrecorded sins. Many kings had sat there, some longer than others, some more willing than others. But always someone sat, until one morning they didn't. There was no announcement, no trumpet call, no gathered court. The doors to the throne room remained closed, as always, and no one entered or left. But a whisper spread, not through voice or scroll, but through knowing glances, through the sudden absence of presence. The king was not on the throne. It was not that he had died. No grave was dug, no mourning decreed. His garments were still pressed. His seal remained intact. His meals were still delivered, untouched, to his private chamber. But the throne, that cold, vast seat of power, sat silent, unclaimed. The first reaction was confusion. The court, what remained of it, hovered at the edges of protocol. Ministers paced, but issued no orders. Servants dusted rooms already clean. Nobles, once so adept at scheming, found themselves paralyzed by the absence of center. Without the throne, there could be no audience. Without an audience, there could be no plan. And without a king, there was no one to betray. So the hall remained quiet, and the throne stayed empty. At first, a few brave, or desperate, souls approached it. A duke whose family had once ruled a distant province stepped up the steps and placed a single hand on the armrest. He spoke no words, issued no claim. He simply touched it, as if to feel its truth. He died 3 days later in his sleep, his body found frozen despite the summer heat. His wife claimed his skin smelled of ash and iron. Next came a general, blood-stained from victories too recent, eyes hungry. He sat upon the throne for 7 heartbeats. No more. Then he rose, walked backwards out the hall, and retired to a monastery where he spoke only once, just before his death. The throne does not forget. After that, no one tried again. The throne became something else, not a symbol of rule, but a monument to refusal, a hollow crown, an echo that cannot be filled. It sat there, perfectly still, as seasons turned outside and the kingdom dimmed, as laws faded, as feasts stretched into madness, as the sun abandoned the sky. It remained untouched and untouched by time. Some began to believe it was never meant to be sat upon, that all those who had done so before had only borrowed it, that the throne itself was a ruler, and the men who perched upon it were merely voices it used, that it had grown tired of puppets, that now it waited, not for a new king, but for silence. Children born after its abandonment were taught never to look at it directly. Their parents would avert their eyes when passing the great hall. Teachers spoke of monarchs past as though they had ruled from somewhere else entirely. A field, a tower, a dream. The throne was too heavy with memory to bear its name aloud. And still it waited. It is said that on certain nights, when the candles in the hall gutter without wind and the stone beneath your feet grows warm, you can hear breathing, not yours, not near, but deep from within the throne itself, as though it remembers every spine that ever rested against its back, as though it counts them one by one, backward and forward, waiting for a name not yet spoken. Others claim that the throne is not empty at all, that someone sits there still, unseen, forgotten, folded into stone, that the mad king, in a final act of retreat, gave up his body and entered the seat itself, that his rule continues, not in words or deeds, but in weight, that he listens to every silence in the kingdom and smiles. Whether this is true or not does not matter, because the throne remains. It casts no shadow, yet dims every room. It bears no marks, yet remembers every ruler. It speaks no word, yet commands obedience. No one sweeps beneath it. No one dusts its arms. No one dares to speak within its hearing, because the throne does not need a king. It is the king, and it is not empty. It is merely waiting. They had no names, but they had been named once. That much was certain, though no one could remember when, or why, or what the names had been, only that they had existed before, long before, and that something at some point had removed them, not just from memory, but from history, from writing, from language itself. They were called the Nameless now, not by decree, not by consensus, but because that was all anyone had left to call them. The word itself, nameless, wasn't their name, but the echo left behind after the real thing had been scraped clean. Their return was not marked by ships or drums, not by conquest or fire, not by heralds riding ahead with banners unfurling. They did not descend from the mountains or rise from the sea. They came softly like fog, like breath on a window pane, like memory slipping through fingers in the dark. At first, no one noticed. There were just more people, that was all. Or at least the suggestion of people. Faces in the crowd no one recognized. Voices heard behind curtains no one remembered drawing. A presence in line at the market, standing quietly, waiting, then gone before you could count them. You might pass one in the square and nod politely, only to realize afterward that you could not recall their face, their features, or even the color of their clothing. The mind slipped around them, like water around a stone. They did not speak, or perhaps they did, but in a language older than ears. Their mouths moved, yes, and sometimes a sound came out, but it did not land, not properly. It passed through listeners, over them, beneath them, a word shaped like loss, like unfinished prayers, like forgotten lullabies hummed through cracked teeth. Some said they had always been here. Others claimed they had returned from where it was less clear, from exile maybe, from beyond the map, from beneath the forest that grew and watched, from behind the mirrors, or perhaps from within the silence itself, that great stretching hush that had swallowed the kingdom over generations. The Nameless did not answer. They only stared, with eyes that held neither kindness nor cruelty, only recognition. They knew who you were, even if you didn't know them. The first to truly notice were the children, not because they were special, not touched by prophecy or innocence, but simply because they still saw, still questioned, still reached. One child asked his mother why the man in the hall had no shadow. The mother, confused, turned to look, only to find the space empty. But the child insisted. Describe him perfectly, except curiously for his face. Another child drew pictures. Always the same tall figure, always in the background, not menacing, not smiling, just there. Over time, the drawings multiplied, until, in one, the child was no longer in the foreground, just a figure. By then, it was clear. The Nameless had returned, not as invaders, not as saviors, not as gods, but as replacements. One by one, people disappeared. Not violently, not suddenly, just gradually, their presence thinning, their voices softening, their names slipping from conversations. A neighbor who used to greet you in the morning would one day walk past in silence. A cousin whose stories you loved would stop coming to dinners. You would remember them vaguely, but the details would fray, then vanish. In their place, the nameless, they wore the same clothes, lived in the same houses, moved with the same routines. But they were not the same. They did not eat. Not really. Their plates remained full, yet no one saw them refill. They stood at windows long after night fell, unmoving. They did not blink. Or perhaps they blinked too often, too precisely, in rhythm, like breathing mimicked rather than lived. And always they watched, not aggressively, not even curiously, just persistently, as if waiting for you to forget your own name, because that's how it began, the forgetting. At first, you'd pause before introducing yourself. Then you'd fumble over letters. Then you'd find your signature strange, as though forged by another hand. Eventually, your name would sound foreign in your mouth, a riddle, a sound too sharp or too soft, too small to hold you. And when your name left you, the nameless would draw nearer, not with open arms, not with malice, just with space. They'd be there, filling the silence, picking up the things you dropped, sleeping in your bed, wearing your coat, and no one would notice, not even you. It was not death. It was not possession. It was surrender, a yielding of identity, a slow evaporation, a slipping beneath the tide of forgetting. Scholars tried to stop it. What few remained. They read old books, scratched notes and margins, shouted names into the dark. But the books crumbled, the ink faded, and the names, real names, old names, dissolved into static. One scholar tried to bind her name to her wrist with ink and thread. When she woke the next day, her hand was gone, cleanly. No blood, no pain, just absence. Another carved her name into stone. The stone split. The pieces could not be found. The king did not resist. Why would he? The nameless had been his allies all along, or perhaps his predecessors. Some whispered that he had been the first of them, that the madness had not been madness, but memory struggling to remain in a mind no longer meant to carry it, that the throne, that cold, unoccupied seat, was not empty because he had left, but because he had returned. And the nameless followed, because they always do. They are not enemies. They are inevitabilities, the result of forgetting too long, of silence too deep, of rule without voice or reason or light. They are what comes when names are lost. And when they are all that remain, there is peace, quiet, order, and a kingdom where no one can ever be forgotten again, because no one remembers anyone at all. It did not begin with a bell or a trumpet or a final scream. There was no announcement, no sudden hush, just a quiet that thickened moment by moment like mist in the lungs. It was not true silence at first. Birds still chirped, somewhere in the trees. Leaves rustled. Fires cracked in hearts. Boots thudded against cobbled streets. But something beneath it all, some deep foundation of noise, was gone. Like a string pulled from a loom, the whole tapestry of sound began to unravel. First, the wind. No one noticed when it stopped. It simply did. Flags drooped. Chimneys stopped their whisper. Doors no longer creaked on gusts. People blamed the weather, as they always did, but weather had never been this still. Then the bells, the town bells that rang on the hour, the monastery chimes that echoed through the hills, even the soft clang of distant metal, all stopped, not broken, not muffled, just absent, struck with the same force, but yielding nothing, as if the air itself no longer carried sound. Next, the animals. Cows stopped lowing. Dogs refused to bark. Chickens wandered the yards in mute confusion. Horses trotted without whinnies, their mouths opening but giving nothing back. Birds perched silently on rooftops, their heads cocked, confused by their own stillness. Somewhere, it was said, a farmer tried to force a rooster to crow by strangling it. Not out of cruelty, but desperation. It flapped its wings and opened its beak, but no sound came out. Children grew frightened, not because they understood, but because they couldn't. Laughter that once filled courtyards was now replaced with wide-eyed stares and silent play. Games fell apart. Stories lost their rhythm. And lullabies became movements only, lips mouthing melodies that never arrived. Some families tried to sing together. to push back the silence with harmony. But even the strongest voices began to fail. Notes vanished before leaving the throat. Melodies became breath. Then nothing. The scholars, few and desperate, labeled it the Great Silence. Not a lack of sound, but the loss of permission to make it. The kingdom, they wrote in ink that would not dry, was entering an age where voice was no longer allowed. The king, of course, said nothing. He had not spoken in years. It was assumed he approved. The silence reached the cities next. Streets at once bustled with merchants, criers, street performers, drunks, all fell into a slow, watchful rhythm. People moved with caution, stepping softly not because they feared being heard, but because they no longer remembered what it meant to be loud. Clerks signed contract with nods. Teachers pointed instead of explaining. Lovers wrote notes. Anger, once loud and messy, became clenched fists and turned backs. Even crying grew still. Shoulders shook, but no sobs escaped. And in the midst of it all, the silence grew heavier. People began to forget what voices sounded like. Not just the voices of others, but their own. Memories of sound became vague. Did your mother's voice ring high or low? Did your brother laugh with a rasp or a chime? The mind tried to fill in the blanks, but the details blurred. Entire families sat together in the evening, mouths shut, eyes watching. Communication became glances, gestures, rituals. A tap on the table for pass the bread. A raised brow for do you remember? A held gaze for please say something. But no one did. Eventually, sound ceased being expected. Doors were opened gently, not out of fear, but routine. Tables were set with no clatter. Chairs moved without scrape. Even the forge, once the loudest place in the village, worked silently. The smith struck iron and the hammer met metal, but nothing echoed. Sparks flew like ghosts, but the clang had vanished. Worse still, people stopped reacting to what little sound did remain. A drop plate would not turn heads. A creaking stair in the middle of the night would draw no investigation. A cough would pass unnoticed, as if the body itself apologized for remembering how. And when a voice did rise, rarely, accidentally, painfully, it rang out like a blasphemy. There is a story, perhaps true, perhaps folklore already, of a child who sang in their sleep. Just a fragment of a tune. A simple melody from another time. Every villager heard it. None spoke of it. The next morning, the child's bed was empty. Their name had been removed from records. And the room they once occupied was silent, in a way beyond silence. Not empty, but sealed. As though the air refused to acknowledge that sound had ever lived there. By now, writing had become the only refuge. Walls filled with chalk marks. Parchments layered with notes. But even these began to fail. Ink faded. Words shifted. Sentences dissolved into symbols. What was once written clearly in the morning would be unreadable by dusk. Then came the forgetting, first of words, then of ideas, then of meaning. People began to forget why they had spoken at all, what purposes words had served. The mechanics of communication remained, the tools, the lips, the tongues, but the concept began to drift, as if speech itself had been a guest, long overstayed, now quietly leaving without goodbyes. It was said that the last word spoken in the kingdom was remember, whispered by an old man into a well. No one heard it, not even the well, and the silence deepened, not in volume, but in presence. It was no longer the absence of sound, but the presence of something else entirely, a watchfulness, a pressure behind the eyes, the weight of being observed, not by a person, not by God, but by the silence itself. You could feel it, beneath your skin, around your bones, in your breath. The people stopped resisting. There was no rebellion, no mutiny, no final cry, only nods, only blinks, only stillness. The kingdom did not fall. It faded, until all that was left was a throne, the skyless halls, the unsleeping king, and the silence. Not a silence of peace, not of rest, but of something waiting, something listening, something that had always been there. There had been many executions. Once, they were a matter of rhythm in the old kingdom, as regular as harvest, as predictable as taxes. Some said they were acts of justice. Others said they were performances. But by the time the kingdom began to wither, to darken, to forget, they had become neither. They had become ritual. The crowd always gathered, not by summons or decree, but by instinct. There was no need for bells or criers or posted notices. The people simply knew when it was time. They would appear in the square before dawn, though dawn no longer came, and wait, unmoving, eyes fixed forward, breath held as if not to disturb what approached. There had been hundreds of such days, perhaps thousands, each one blurring into the next. The names of the condemned had long stopped mattering. Their crimes were relevant, their guilt assumed. Even their words, pleas, confessions, curses, faded before reaching the air. The executions were not for truth. They were for silence, for order, for continuity in a world that had forgotten everything but fear. And so the scaffold stood. It was built not of wood, but of stone, cold, unyielding, unchanging. No creak of planks, no sway in the breeze. Just a flat surface, gray and featureless, raised 3 steps above the ground and stained with years of memory that refused to wash away. The blade had once gleamed, a cruel arc of iron, sharp enough to split a whisper, but now it was dull, not from use, for it never failed, but from something else, as though the metal had grown tired, as though it had come to resent the weight of what it had done. And the executioner, well, he had no name, or, if he did, no one remembered it. He wore no mask, for there was no longer shame, no audience to fear, no protest to hush. His face was plain, unremarkable, his eyes hollow yet seeing. He never spoke, not before, not after. He simply stepped forward, did what was required, and stepped back in the shadows that always seemed to wait for him. But this day, this last day, was different. It was different because it was the end. Not the end of the executions, the end of everything. No one knew how they knew, but they did. They came in silence, as always, but there was something final in the way their feet fell on the stones. Something slow, measured, like the last turn of a key. The sky above was darker than usual, if such a thing was possible, a black so deep it seemed to pull light inward. The air was still, heavy, expectant, and on the scaffold there stood the condemned, a figure cloaked in gray, bound not by rope, but by stillness. No name was read, no list of crimes, no decree. The crowd didn't require one. The executioner did not bow, did not prepare the blade. He simply stood and waited. The figure raised their head. And that was when it changed, because it was him, the king. There was no mistaking it, even after years unseen, even after memory had grown brittle and blurred, even though he wore no crown, no regalia. It was the way he stood, not proud, not ashamed, but resigned, the way the silence bent around him, the way the air seemed to lean in. The crowd did not murmur, did not gasp. They simply watched, because they had no choice. He looked at them, each of them, or so it felt. His eyes passed over the masses not with fear, not with fury, but with recognition, as if he knew every face, had seen every life, had written every silence they had endured. And then, for the first time in years, perhaps decades, he spoke. Just one word, soft, broken, enough. The sound did not echo. It did not shake the stones. But it was heard, not in ears, but in bones, in memory, in the hollow spaces where names had once been. The executioner flinched. His hands, always steady, trembled. The blade, dull though it was, gleamed once, then dimmed, and then nothing. No drop, no swing. The king stepped down from the scaffold. No one stopped him. The executioner let the blade fall to the ground, not upon flesh, but upon stone, where it shattered like glass. The crowd parted, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. The king walked slowly, as though each step pulled against centuries, past the faces that had once worshipped, then feared, then forgotten him. And as he walked, the silence lifted, not suddenly, not loudly, but gently, like mist burned away by an unseen sun. A breath returned to the world, a whisper of wind, a creak of branch. Somewhere, faint, almost lost, a bird sang. Just once. People wept, not loudly, not in despair, just quietly, as if finally allowed to feel something that was not numbness. The king walked beyond the square, beyond the town, beyond the kingdom, into the trees, and was never seen again. The scaffold remained, but no one approached it. The executioner vanished. The crowds no longer gathered. The square grew moss, then grass, then flowers. People began to speak again, tentatively, clumsily, as if relearning the shape of sound. And though no one dared rule, though no throne was ever reclaimed, the kingdom, what remained of it, began to breathe, softly, quietly, but alive. The silence, when it came now, was not a curse. It was a choice, a space between words, a pause before forgiveness. And the last execution, not of a man, not of a crime, but of a cycle, was remembered not in records, but in relief. It was over, not with war, not with revolt, not with fire, but with a whisper. Enough.